Hello and welcome to our 6th lesson on the Scottish Wars of Independence. Today we're going to be looking at the Treaties of Salisbury and Birgham. Our aim today is to learn how the factions competing for influence over the Maid and Scotland's future negotiated to achieve their aims, and by the end of this session we should be able to describe the key points of the Treaties of Salisbury and Birgham, be able to explain how the political manoeuvrings of Eric, Edward and the Guardians affected Scotland's future security and independence, and be able to make an assessment of what King Edward was really up to at this stage of events. So to begin, we're going to recap, as promised from last session, with the problem of the Maid and how her position as the ruler oncoming of Scotland through 1286-89 presented problems to the kingdom. Now, if you remember from our last session, we finished up with this. I asked you guys to explain for yourselves why each one of these factors created an issue for the rulers of Scotland during the years 1286-89. The first one was given for you, the fact that she was so young and the problems that created. She's too young to rule the kingdom herself, obviously, as in 1286 when Alexander III died, she was only 2 years old. The regents, the 6 Guardians of Scotland, would therefore have to rule the country for a number of years until the Maid had grown old enough to take the control of the kingdom for herself. There's also the spectre of childhood mortality at that time to take into account, as 1 in 3 children would not live to the age of 5. Our second reason, and one for you guys to have had to think about, was that she was from Norway. The Maid of Norway's father was King Eric II of Norway, whilst her mother had been Princess Margaret, Alexander III's daughter. She had been born in Norway and had been raised in Norway. Although she's still very young, she's unlikely to know Scots Gaelic at that time, so there'll be a language barrier there. She's also going to be very much influenced by her Norwegian family rather than Scottish relatives. So she's very much coming from from an outsider's perspective when she is coming across to Scotland. So there's that kind of barrier for her to overcome as she hopefully grows up through into adulthood. How is that going to affect her perceptions of the kingdom that she's moving to take over, and what kind of influences is she going to bring with her? Third issue with the Maid of Norway was her gender. Now remember, the medieval times were obviously far more sexist than they are now. It was extremely unusual for a woman to rise to a position of high authority in medieval society, and women did not fight in battles. Alexander III, although his reign had been largely peaceful, at the start of his reign, if you recall, he defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Largs and then set about on a campaign to pacify the unruly nobles up in the northwest of the kingdom. The Maid of Norway would not be in a position to lead her army, as women were not expected to take the battlefield and she would not be trained to fight or to lead an army. This put Scotland at a disadvantage compared to neighbouring medieval kingdoms. A fourth reason for the Maid being a problem was thinking ahead to what happens when she gets married. Medieval princes and princesses often had arranged marriages set in place for them, and often from quite an early age. However, when she did get married, and in a society where males had primacy over women, we have to take into account the fact that her husband is going to have a heavy influence over the Kingdom of Scotland. If that's the Scottish noble, we have the problem of potential civil war looming. The families in Scotland are not going to sit back and just watch as one of the noble families gets elevated above the others and becomes the top dog. Likewise, if she marries a foreign prince, we have the difficult issue of foreign influence over the country, and how do we manage that? Now, these are all problems that Scotland faces taking on the Maid of Norway as the next ruling monarch. However, in 1290, things are moving forward. The Maid of Norway has now got to the age of about 6 or 7, and the different political players involved in Scotland's future are starting to look to the future and to organise what that's going to look like for the kingdom. And that's where we go to in today's session. Now, to recap, the Guardians have been in control of the country of Scotland from 1286 through to 1290. When they were placed in power by the Community of the Realm in 1286, they were given a set of rules to run the kingdom by. The important one that we're going to be looking at for this session is that the Guardians were going to be made responsible for finding the Maid a suitable husband. So in other words, guaranteeing the ongoing security of the royal line and succession of Alexander III's descendants remaining on top of the throne. We need to set ourselves up with a partner for the Maid. And the problems facing the Guardians at this time. From 1286 to 89, the Guardians ruled in the name of the Maid, acting as her regents. But without the authority of a single king to control the kingdom, Scotland faces some serious problems. And to remind you, there was a threat of civil war. The Bruce family had formed the Turnberry Band down in southwest Scotland to launch a coup or an armed rebellion to seize the throne for themselves. At this time, the Lord Bruce, not Robert the Bruce as we're going to meet later on in our course, but instead his grandfather, is pushing on into his 70s, so time is short if he's going to make his move for power. The coup was unsuccessful, but the outbreak of further civil war remains a serious threat to the kingdom. Bruce backed down, but he was not dealt with. Without royal power and authority, the Isle of Man was also lost as it rebelled against Scottish control. The Guardians lacked the military authority, power and finances to launch a campaign to return the Isle of Man to the Kingdom of Scotland. So what was the answer to the problems? It seemed to be the obvious answer was to arrange a royal wedding. If Scotland, the kingdom, could partner itself with a powerful ally who would be promised to the Maid through one of their princes as her husband, then potentially Scotland and the Guardians would gain a very big stick to beat off any rivals and to quell disquiet amongst the kingdom. So a marriage alliance with a powerful noble or royal house would solve the potential threat of civil war in Scotland, so that would ward off the Bruces, and powerful ambitious Scottish families such as the Bruces would stop causing trouble if a husband was chosen for the Maid from a suitably strong family or kingdom. A noble family like the Bruces would be crazy to go up against basically an entire kingdom who had a vested interest in the future of Scotland. So guaranteeing that through a treaty or a marriage alliance for the Maid's future would cause the Bruce to back down. And bearing in mind the age of old Bruce, this is going to be a shorter term problem. In a few years Bruce will no longer be around and the political situation will change again. So doubt over the future of the Maid and the future rule of the kingdom would be removed, and that period of uncertainty and unrest would come to an end. If only a successful marriage could be organised. Now, it was the Maid's father, King Eric II of Norway, who set events in motion at first. In May 1289, he sent ambassadors across the sea to Edward I, proposing to marry Margaret off to Edward's young son, also called Edward. Now, as we go through our topic, we're going to find out that the people at the top end of medieval society in Britain are extremely uncreative when it comes to naming, so we're going to come across an awful lot of Edwards and Margarets to confuse things. So, Edward, the first son, at this point called Edward of Caernarfon, will become Edward II, but this young boy, about the same age as the Maid of Norway, is being basically lined up as her future partner. Born in 1284, the young Prince Edward was King Edward's only surviving son. His three other sons had all died in childhood, the last of which, Alfonso, had died only months after the young Prince Edward was born. And there's something to bear in mind there. Had Alfonso lived, England would have had a King Alfonso I. God knows what that would have done to the succeeding names that we would have seen pop up through the years after that. Now the Guardians now found themselves in a weak position. They had been excluded from the negotiating process. The Guardians had been put in place by the community of the realm to organise the future of the Maid, to organise her husband, and yet her dad, King Eric, had been the one to put the ball rolling. It wasn't the Guardians, and Eric had seized the initiative. So by organising a potential mate for his daughter with the young Prince Edward of England, he is setting up the future of Scotland, and it's been organised between Norway and England. Scotland here is being cut out of the picture. So it's quite an alarming turn of events for the Guardians. So to hammer out this agreement and to get it written down in law, they decide to write up the Treaty of Salisbury in 1289. So returned from his wars in France, Edward meets the Guardians, including a faction of the Bruces, at Salisbury in October 1289. Interesting fact, Salisbury Cathedral has one of the highest spires in the whole of England. Quite an impressive building for medieval times. Now, the Treaty of Salisbury called for no further marriage negotiations to be made regarding the Maid until she was in Scotland. So basically this is the Norwegians and the English sealing a deal. They are cutting the Guardians out. The Guardians after this point, if they sign on the dotted line and agree to what Eric and Edward are proposing, will not be able to go off on their own and set up their own potential candidate to become Margaret's husband. This is quite an important deal for Scotland's future. Now, Margaret was to be in Scotland as part of this deal no later than November the 1st, 1290. So she has 1 year to get herself across from Norway to Scotland. Now, at this point, remember, the girl is about 6 years old. Now, the Guardian's position is weak, as it became clear that Eric could basically decide himself who Margaret is going to marry. As her father, and as the Maid of Norway is in the court of the Norwegian king, it becomes very clear that he decides her future and where she's going to go. So the Guardians really have a very weak hand to play here. They can't really influence events that much once they get around the negotiating table. They find that they have been sidelined before it even starts. So accepting that they would now be unable to choose Scotland's next king for themselves, the Guardians caved and they signed the treaty. So Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the future ruler of Scotland, is now set on a path that will unite the kingdoms of Scotland and England through royal marriage. The dilemma of the Guardians. What is the situation they therefore find themselves in? There are pros and cons to the Treaty of Salisbury for Scotland and for the situation the Guardians found themselves in. So let's go through the pros first. Edward was a strong ruler of a powerful kingdom. A marriage alliance with his son, the young Prince Edward, would stabilise the monarchy of Scotland and it would end the threat of civil war. This would make the Bruces back off. England is one of the most powerful kingdoms in medieval Western Europe at this time. A marriage alliance with them is absolutely going to make the Bruces back down. They will not mess with King Edward I. So that plays into the Guardians' hands. A marriage alliance to England would deter other enemies from attacking Scotland for years to come. So not only are we talking about making the Bruces back off, potentially we are also fobbing off Norway. We're not going to see further Viking attacks. And any other kingdoms that might have a bit of an interest in potentially grabbing a bit of Scotland. The cons, however, let's balance that against the pros. So the Guardians felt they needed to be involved in the marriage treaty rather than just sidelined and ignored as they had been in Eric and Edward's negotiations before the Treaty of Salisbury. So the Guardians realised they need to get back on the front foot here. They're anxious about Edward basically making a power grab and seizing Scottish sovereignty. So Edward, although he had been Alexander III's brother-in-law, now no longer has his brother-in-law on the scene in order to remain friendly. So the Guardians don't really have a direct link to Edward I for Scotland to consider itself in England's good books. They're wary that Edward has an eye to Scotland, and basically, by setting up his son with the Maid of Norway, he has an eye to the future and an eye to England basically absorbing Scotland into its growing territories. At this point, Edward I has his eye on making a Western European empire. He has England. He has recently conquered Wales. He has sent armies across to conquer large sections of Ireland. And he also, at this point, controls about half of France. Edward is a major European player. Adding Scotland to his list of territories is by no means implausible. So the Guardians want safeguards included in the next treaty to legally ensure the long-term rights and customs of Scotland. And that's where we have a look at our next treaty. The Treaty of Birgham. Now, whereas the Treaty of Salisbury was, I guess, the starter to proceedings, the Treaty of Birgham is the main event, it's the main course. This is the important one for the union between England and Scotland. So in July 1290, the Scottish Guardians and Edward I's ambassadors agreed the marriage contract between Margaret, the Maid of Norway, and Prince Edward. And the meetings were held in Birgham, in Berkshire, in northeast England. Now, Birgham is very close to the English-Scottish border, so it's the closest thing I suppose they could have to almost kind of neutral ground. So the document was a very detailed one, and it includes a number of meticulous safeguards to preserve Scotland's independence. Now here are the key points as shown on the scroll. And the point of this is what the Guardians are trying to secure. They had been sidelined, if you remember, the Treaty of Salisbury. In the Treaty of Birgham, they want to make sure that Scotland is not going to simply just be subsumed into a greater England. So they are setting out in law a list of measures that are going to protect Scotland and make sure it remains independent, even in the face of a marriage between its future Queen and the future King of England. So the major terms are Margaret, the Maid of Norway, would marry Edward's son, Edward of Caernarfon. Remember, at this point, he is not yet Edward II, so he is Edward of Caernarfon. It's the castle where he was born in Wales. Secondly, Scottish independence would be safeguarded, its borders would be respected. So the border between the two kingdoms of England and Scotland will remain in place. Scotland will not just become one country with England. Thirdly, Scottish laws, liberties and customs were to be preserved. There's a different set of laws at play in Scotland. It's done differently from how it was done down in the Kingdom of England. Scottish laws are to remain as they were. They are not to be simply overruled and replaced with English customs instead. Fourthly, no parliament governing Scotland would be held in England. So in other words, if the Maid goes off to live down with Prince Edward down in London, then if she wants to have a meeting with the nobles of Scotland to decide Scottish policy or how taxes are going to be spent, that needs to take place in Scotland. She can't just get the nobles to come down to her in London. This is an important point of recognising continuing Scottish sovereignty. Scottish business needs to be done in Scotland. Fifth, Scotland's church would be free of outside interference. Now, for years before this, the Church of England had been trying to take control of the Church of Scotland. At this point, there is no Protestant and Catholic. All Christian churches are just Catholic. The Church of England had an archbishop. It had a high-ranking church official. The Scottish Church didn't have one. It just had bishops. So the Archbishop of England tried to assert the authority of the English Church over Scotland because he was higher ranking than them. Scotland had an ongoing complaint about this, determining that they were in fact independent and that the Church of England had nothing to do with them. The Guardians make sure that the independence of Scotland's church will be an ongoing matter. And lastly, important positions would be held by Scots, and the taxes raised in Scotland were just for Scottish needs. So we've got important government ministers, must be Scots, and we cannot appoint English nobles to become, say for instance, the new Chancellor or the new Treasurer of Scotland, and that money raised by taxes in Scotland, paid by Scottish peasants and Scottish lords, could only be spent on Scottish needs. Scottish money cannot therefore pay for English wars. So, historical debate. Now, the further on you go through history, the more involved you'll become in the opinions of different historians as they argue about what's going on. Often history is open to interpretation. The story that we have coming down to us is one person's point of view of events. And historians, one of their jobs is to pick apart those points of view and find out the true story of what's going on. We're kind of like, in a way, detectives of the past. So in this circumstance, the Treaty of Birgham, there's quite a bit of debate about what was actually going down when this treaty was being thrashed out. Here are the arguments. The modern point of view is that Edward I played this fair, he played it straight down the line, and he wasn't overly taking advantage of Scotland at this time. So that's the Edward is our friend's point of view. The old-fashioned traditional point of view is that Edward was a bit of a villain and he was out to get everything he could from Scotland, and this was part of his power play to basically take control of the Kingdom of Scotland. So that'll be Edward's not to be trusted. When you dig deeper into the history of this and you'd be given source questions in university, you could be given essays on this, you would have to analyse the views, the facts of both sides, and come up with your kind of argued conclusion on which one is right. For us today, we're going to have a look at the two different sides of this debate. So first up, Edward is our friend. So on this side, we're looking at Edward being basically a good guy who's playing it straight and isn't taking advantage of Scotland. So facts to support that point of view. Edward agreed to the demands of the Guardians as negotiated at Birgham. Unlike in Salisbury, when the Guardians were pretty much sidelined and more or less just ignored, they were just a guest meet in the room, and the Guardians at Birgham play a major role, and Edward takes them on. He listens to what they've got to say, and their concerns are part of the treaty. They are written down to become law. So Edward listens. In Birgham, Edward also agrees to the continuance of Scottish independence. Scotland will not just be absorbed into England, even though his son is marrying the future Queen of Scotland. And if we remember from medieval custom, men have power over women. So Edward is taking special measures here to make sure that Scotland can maintain its independence and its difference from England. Edward also did not try at this point to have the Scots acknowledge him as the overlord of Scotland. Now, overlord is an interesting term, and we're going to hear that an awful lot in the coming weeks on the Scottish topic. An overlord is someone who's more powerful than a king. You can have kings of several kind of lands in an area and so on, but kings are often of different powers. Say for instance, the king of a tiny principality like Luxembourg in Europe is going to be nowhere near as powerful as the king of the whole of France. Okay, so even though the two people both have the same rank, the same title, king, it might be that the king of Luxembourg in that example would do what the king of France told him to do, because the king of France is more powerful. In that case, the king of France would be the overlord of the King of Luxembourg. Edward isn't trying to force that relationship onto Scotland. He's not trying to get the Scots to recognise him as the most powerful king at this stage. He is giving them equal status in the relationship to come. Now, against that, things that make us think Edward's up to something here and we shouldn't trust him. At the same time as agreeing to the treaty, Edward's forces sneakily take a ship and go off and seize the Isle of Man. Now, that used to be Scottish territory. Fair enough, the Guardians hadn't sent an army of their own out to go and return it after it rebelled against Scottish rule, but Edward sneaking a fleet across there to go and grab that island just does not quite sit right, does it? He is kind of taking Scottish territory and absorbing it into England on the sly. Edward also insisted that one of his lords, Anthony Beck, the Bishop Prince of Durham, that's the most powerful lord in the north of England at the time, should replace the Guardians, and he should run Scotland in the name of Margaret until she was old enough to rule. Now, that seems quite dodgy. So until the 6-year-old Maid of Norway is old enough to rule the country herself, potentially when she's 21 in 15 years' time, Edward is pushing for an Englishman to run the Kingdom of Scotland and replace the Guardians that the community of Scotland's realm had agreed to put in place. That seems dubious. In 1290, Edward also demands the Scottish Church should pay taxes to England. Now, that was one of the key terms of the Treaty of Birgham, that the Scottish Church was to remain independent. Edward here is trying to exert English authority onto one of the key institutions of the Scottish government. The Church at this time is a huge deal, so if the Scottish Church becomes basically the puppet of the Archbishop of Canterbury down in England, then England has quite a powerful say over what goes on in Scotland. And then lastly, at Salisbury, Edward demanded that the Maid should be handed over to him and raised in the English court until Scotland was safe. Now, some historians have claimed that this is a valid point by Edward. He has basically offered up his son, his 7-year-old son, to marry this girl, and he is basically, as a good father-in-law, trying to make sure that the girl is kept safe. If she is allowed to grow up in Scotland, we don't know which various different lords might rise to the fore or try and kidnap her or make a power grab and take the maid away. Edward is trying to keep her safe, and he knows that she would be safe if she grew up at the court of Edward down in London. So his demand that she grows up at the English court isn't unusual, I suppose, and the Guardians would have recognised that. However, that is a bit of a power grab again. Whoever has the maid basically has control of the future of Scotland. So, to complete today's section on the two treaties, the Treaties of Salisbury and Birgham, I'd like you guys to have a go at these questions. We have 3 to look at today. The first 2 are fairly straightforward. The third one is where I want you to have a good think for yourself. Now, have a look at those pros and cons about whether or not we should trust Edward at the end of today's session there, and come to the decision for yourself. Should the Guardians be trusting Edward in 1290, or should they be a bit more suspicious that he has some form of ulterior motive on the go? Give a reason to support your answer, and that's us for today. Thanks very much, guys. See you next time.